The only thing standing between Leroy and health insurance was a parking space. One spot. That's all they needed. One spot in this concrete maze of a hospital parking garage, and they could walk into that interview composed, confident, exactly the kind of person who deserved stability. But if they didn't get it, if they had to park in the overflow lot and sprint back sweating and flustered, they could kiss those benefits goodbye. Kiss the chance to finally see a doctor about the pain in their side goodbye. Kiss any hope of making it past next month's rent goodbye. The Honda's engine wheezed as Leroy navigated the tight turns, and on the dashboard, 3 red envelopes sat like tiny gravestones. Rent, utilities, student loans that had somehow multiplied like tumors. The cracked windshield fractured the early morning sun into 1,000 tiny daggers, each one a reminder that this car, like everything else in their life, was held together by desperation and prayer. 7:15. That's when the interview started. 7:15, and it was already 6:45, which should have been plenty of time, except the garage was packed. First floor, nothing. Second floor, worse. By the third floor, Leroy's hands were slick with sweat despite the broken air conditioning, despite the October chill seeping through the gaps in the door seals. Their phone buzzed in the cup holder. Probably their roommate asking if they could cover the electric bill this month or if they needed to work something out again. Everything was always about working something out. About stretching $42 until Friday's direct deposit. About choosing between eating and keeping the lights on and hoping you chose right. Then they saw it. One spot. Right there. Golden. Perfect. Close enough to the sky bridge that they'd arrive early, calm, ready to convince someone they were worth $8 more an hour and dental coverage. Leroy gunned it. The Honda lurched forward with the enthusiasm of a dying racehorse, transmission groaning, but it responded. It moved, and for one beautiful second, victory was certain. Until the Tesla appeared. Sleek, black, silent as a predator. It materialized from the down ramp like something out of a nightmare, and Leroy's stomach dropped because they both saw it. They were both going for it, and this was about to get very, very ugly. But Leroy was closer.
3 seconds ahead, maybe 4.
They could make it. They had to make it. The Honda shuddered and slid into that spot like they were stealing home plate. And the relief that flooded through Leroy's body was so intense, it was almost painful. Hands shaking on the wheel, breath coming in short gasps, they'd done it. They'd actually done it. They were going to be okay. Then they looked in the rearview mirror and felt their heart stop. The Tesla had stopped, just sitting there in the lane, idling with that expensive electric silence. Through the windshield, Leroy could see the driver. A black woman, mid-40s, designer sunglasses, the kind of put-together that screamed, life in order. She wasn't honking, wasn't gesturing, just waiting with the kind of patience that was somehow more devastating than anger. Her phone rang. Speaker mode. The parking garage's weird acoustics turned it into a broadcast. "Dr. Alloway, we need you in OR3 immediately." Every hair on Leroy's body stood up. "Subdural hematoma, patient's deteriorating fast. Dr. Patterson's stuck in traffic on the freeway. You're our only shot." No. No, 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 no. Dr. Alloway's voice came through calm, controlled. The kind of calm that came from holding people's lives in your hands every single day. "I'm in the parking garage now. Should be up in 10 minutes. Can you make it 8? Patient's blood pressure's dropping." Leroy watched in the mirror as Dr. Alloway's head turned, scanning the garage. Calculating. The far lot. The overflow section that was a 7-minute hike in good weather, Longer if you were trying not to break into a run. If she parked there, those 8 minutes became 15.
Maybe 20. If she parked there, someone died. The math was brutal and simple and sitting right there in Leroy's chest like a stone. But this spot, the spot Leroy was currently occupying, the spot that meant arriving at their interview on time and composed, this would get her there. This would save a life. 7:15. The interview that would save Leroy's life. Without this job, the eviction notice graduated from threat to reality. Without health insurance, that 3 a.m. pain wasn't getting checked. Without those $8 extra an hour, next month didn't exist. Leroy's hands were frozen on the steering wheel. Brain screaming calculations. If they gave up this spot, they'd have to park in overflow. 7 minutes of walking, probably more if they were trying not to show up drenched in sweat and breathing hard. They'd arrive flustered, making exactly the wrong impression, probably losing the job before they even opened their mouth. But someone was dying, right now, while Leroy sat here doing math about their own convenience, about their own survival. Someone's brain was bleeding out. Their hands moved before their brain caught up. Reverse gear. The Honda lurched backward. Leroy waved frantically toward the spot, pointed at the hospital entrance like that would explain everything, like Dr. Alloway would understand the magnitude of what was being sacrificed. The Tesla moved forward immediately. Dr. Alloway didn't wave back, didn't acknowledge the gesture, just took the spot with the efficiency of someone who didn't have time for gratitude, who had exactly 8 minutes to save a life and not 1 second to waste. The door opened. "Doctor!"
Alloway emerged at speed, leather bag slung over her shoulder, stride eating up distance. She disappeared into the sky bridge without looking back, and Leroy sat there, idling in the middle of the garage like an idiot. They'd just given away their future to save a stranger. The overflow lot was a circle of hell Dante forgot to mention. Gravel, potholes, a faded sign that read, "Employee parking only," even though half the spaces sat empty at this ungodly hour. Leroy found a spot at the very back, because of course it was at the very back, and killed the engine. 6:52. The interview was at 7:15. Still 23 minutes. Tight, but doable if they moved fast. They grabbed their folder of documents, resume they'd spent 3 hours formatting,
References from former students and the department chair who'd looked genuinely sad about cutting their hours. Transcript showing a master's degree in sociology that had prepared them for exactly nothing the job market wanted. The car door opened and October air slapped them in the face. Cold, sharp. They should have brought a jacket, but the only professional jacket they owned had a broken zipper, and getting it fixed cost $12 they didn't have. Leroy locked the Honda, whispered, "Please start later, please, I'm begging you," and started walking. Fast. That aggressive power walk of someone who was definitely not running, but absolutely was running. Halfway across the lot, their phone exploded. Buzz, buzz, buzz. 3 texts in rapid succession, which meant emergency, which meant everything was about to get worse.
Leroy pulled out the phone, still walking, and felt the ground tilt sideways.
Hospital HR. All 3 messages from hospital HR. Interview for data entry position has been moved up to 7 a.m. Please confirm attendance. Second attempt. Interview now scheduled for 7 a.m. Respond ASAP. Final notice. Position interview at 7 a.m. No response will be considered withdrawal of application. 7 o'clock. It was 6:55. Leroy was still 8 minutes from the building at a dead sprint, and they couldn't sprint, couldn't show up gasping and soaked in sweat, couldn't make an even worse impression than showing up late. Their fingers fumbled with the phone screen, typing desperately, "On hospital grounds, can be there by 7:10. Please allow grace period."
They hit send and started running. Actually running.
Because showing up sweaty beat showing up never. And maybe they could salvage this disaster. The folder slapped against their hip with every step. The too tight thrift store shoes turned each stride into agony, blisters forming in real time. Their breath came in ragged gasps, cold air shredding their lungs, and they could feel it, could feel every single thing falling apart. 7:02. The sky bridge visible now, so close, tantalizingly close. People in scrubs turned to stare as Leroy sprinted past like someone was chasing them with a knife. Someone was. Poverty. Eviction. The slow, grinding death of being 32 with a master's degree and no health insurance. 7:04. They burst through the hospital's main entrance and nearly collided with an elderly man in a wheelchair. Swerved, apologized breathlessly. Didn't stop. The directory on the wall swam in their vision. Human Resources, 4th floor. Of course it was the 4th floor. Of course. The elevator took eternities. Leroy stood in the corner, trying to control their breathing, trying to smooth down their hair, trying to look like someone who deserved a chance. The other people gave them space, that unconscious social distance people maintain around someone who's clearly having a breakdown. 7:09. The doors opened. Leroy stumbled out, followed the signs, found the glass door marked Personnel Services. They pushed through, trying to arrange their face into something approximating professional calm. "Hi, I'm Leroy Lamar. I have an interview for the data entry position. I know I'm a few minutes late, but I was on the property and—" The receptionist held up one finger.
Didn't look away from her screen. Kept typing for another 30 seconds, while Leroy's heart tried to claw its way out of their chest. Then she looked up, expression carefully neutral.
Leroy Lamar, 7 o'clock interview. Yes, I'm so sorry. There was a parking situation and an emergency and the position has been filled.
The words landed like a hammer to the sternum. Leroy's brain blue-screened, crashed, tried to reboot.
I'm sorry? What? The position has been filled. We had another candidate who was already here at 7. Strong qualifications. Available to start immediately. We made the decision to move forward. But it's only 7:10,
I texted to explain.
I was literally on the property. I understand, but we needed someone who could demonstrate punctuality and reliability. Those are key qualities for this role.
The receptionist's voice wasn't unkind, but it had that practiced quality of someone who delivered bad news so many times they'd learned to remove all emotion from the process. Leroy stood there holding their folder of worthless paper. All that hope and effort condensed into documents no one would ever read. They wanted to explain about Dr. Alloway, about the parking spot, about the impossible choice between their own survival and someone else's life. But how could they explain without sounding like they were making excuses? How could they make this woman understand they just sacrificed everything? Is there a waiting list? Other positions opening soon? The receptionist's expression softened slightly, which somehow made everything infinitely worse.
You can check our online portal. Positions are posted as they become available.
Translation? Don't hold your breath. Translation? You're done here. Leroy nodded, not trusting their voice, and turned away from the desk. Walked back through the glass door, past the elevator, and found a bathroom where they locked themselves in a stall and tried very, very hard not to completely shatter into 1,000 pieces. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. However long it took to get their breathing under control, to convince themselves that crying in a hospital bathroom wasn't going to solve anything, wasn't going to pay rent or fix their car or make any of this okay. When they finally emerged, they made their way back to the overflow lot in a daze. The walk that had taken 7 minutes at a sprint took 15 at this zombified shuffle.
The Honda sat where they'd left it, covered in pollen, looking as defeated as Leroy felt. They got in, tossed the folder onto the passenger seat, where it landed with a pathetic slap. Turned the key. Click, click, whirr. Nothing. They turned it again. The engine made a sound like something dying, that horrible clicking whir that meant the battery was completely, utterly dead. Leroy sat there in their dead car in the empty overflow lot and laughed. Not a happy laugh, not even close. It was the laugh of someone who'd run completely out of options, who'd arrived at the end of hope and found only more problems waiting with open arms. The parking spot that was supposed to save their life had destroyed it instead. And the worst part? They'd do it again. Because what else could they have done?
Let someone die so they could show up on time to a data entry interview? They pulled out their phone and started searching for jumpstart services. Roadside assistance they couldn't afford. The cheapest option was $75. Their checking account had $42 until Friday's direct deposit from the coffee shop. Leroy called their roommate, explained the situation with a voice that sounded hollow even to their own ears. Got a credit card number they could use with the promise, another promise, to pay it back by end of month. The tow truck took 90 minutes to arrive. The driver was kind, didn't ask too many questions, got the Honda running with practiced efficiency. Leroy thanked him, paid with their roommate's borrowed credit, and drove home in silence. The radio was broken anyway.
Nothing but the sound of the failing engine and their own spiraling thoughts. That evening, they updated their resume, applied to 17 different jobs, got 3 automated rejection emails within an hour, fell asleep on the couch scrolling through listings for positions they were overqualified for, underqualified for, perfectly qualified for, but would never get because someone else was always just slightly better, slightly more punctual, slightly more what the world wanted. The weeks blurred into a grey smear of existence. More coffee shop shifts, a brief stint doing gig delivery work until the car started making a new concerning noise that sounded like money they didn't have. Another adjunct course got added for spring semester, 40 minutes away, same poverty wages as always. 2 months crawled by like wounded animals.
Then came the morning that changed everything.
Leroy was pulling a double shift at the coffee shop near the hospital, the one that catered to medical professionals grabbing caffeine before saving lives. They'd gotten good at the small talk, at remembering regular orders, at smiling through bone-deep exhaustion. The morning rush was dying down when she walked in. Dr. Alloway. Leroy's hands froze on the espresso machine. There she was. Surgical scrubs. Phone to her ear. That same confident stride that made crowds part instinctively. Did she recognize them? Probably not. Leroy had been just another desperate person in a parking garage, a momentary blip in a day full of life and death decisions. Dr. Alloway finished her call and approached the counter, barely glancing at the menu. Good morning.
What can I get started for you? Leroy's customer service voice was automatic, muscle memory.
I need 12 coffees for my surgical team. 4 dark roast, 4 medium, 4 decaf. And throw in a dozen pastries, whatever's fresh.
Absolutely. That'll be just a few minutes. Leroy started preparing the order, hands moving through familiar motions, while Dr. Alloway stepped aside to take another call. Less urgent this time, more administrative.
Patient advocacy, she was saying, frustration sharp in her voice. The board finally approved funding. We're looking for someone who can interface between patients and staff, help navigate the system, especially for people who are overwhelmed or don't speak English as a first language. Someone with people skills. Someone who actually gives a damn.
Leroy's hands stopped moving.
Patient advocacy. That sounded like something they could actually do. Something that might use their sociology degree, their teaching experience, Their entire life spent navigating systems designed to defeat people like them. I don't care about their resume, Dr. Alloway continued. I care about whether they show up when it matters, whether they see people, not just case numbers. You can teach someone medical terminology. You can't teach them to give a damn about someone's grandmother who doesn't understand why her insurance won't cover the medication keeping her alive. She paused, listening. Fine. Post it on the portal. But I'm telling you, we're not going to find the right person through traditional hiring. The people who are good at this work are usually the ones who've been chewed up by the system themselves. The call ended.
Dr. Alloway seemed to notice Leroy for the first time. Really notice them. Not just as a barista, but as a person. Sorry about that. Work drama. No worries. Leroy slid the first batch of coffees across the counter.
Sounds like an interesting program, though. Patient advocacy.
You were listening. It wasn't quite an accusation. More an observation. Leroy felt heat creep up their neck.
Didn't mean to, just... It sounded like something I'd be interested in, if I had the qualifications.
Dr. Alloway tilted her head, studying Leroy with the kind of assessment that probably made medical students sweat during rounds. What kind of qualifications do you think you'd need?
I don't know. Medical background? Healthcare administration experience? I have a master's in sociology and I teach part-time, but that's probably not what you're looking for. Sociology.
Dr. Alloway smiled, and it transformed her entire face from intimidating to approachable.
That's exactly what we're looking for, actually. Someone who understands systems, understands people, can see the gaps between what we think we're providing and what patients actually experience.
Leroy's heart was doing something complicated in their chest. Hope and skepticism fighting for dominance.
I wouldn't even know where to apply.
Dr. Alloway pulled out her wallet, but instead of a credit card, she extracted a business card. Heavy stock, embossed letters. She set it on the counter between them like a gift, like a second chance.
Call this number. Ask for Susan in HR. Tell her Dr. Alloway suggested you reach out about the patient advocate position. I don't want special treatment. If there's a regular application process, there is, and Susan will tell you all about it. But sometimes, the best candidates don't come through traditional channels. Sometimes, they're the ones who've been trying to navigate the system themselves, who know what it's like when things don't work the way they're supposed to. She picked up the first carrier of coffees, balanced it with practiced ease, and looked Leroy directly in the eyes. Neither did I once. She was responding to Leroy's earlier comment about not having experience. Everyone starts somewhere. The question is whether you're willing to show up and do the work. Then she was gone. Her surgical team's order distributed across 2 carriers, the pastry bag tucked under her arm, moving back toward the hospital with that same purposeful stride Leroy remembered from the parking garage. Leroy stood behind the counter, the business card in their hand, and felt something they hadn't felt in months. Not quite hope, because hope felt too dangerous, too much like setting themselves up for another crushing disappointment. But possibility. Maybe just possibility. The sense that the door wasn't completely closed, that there might be another chance, another way forward that didn't involve choosing between rent and eating. They tucked the card into their apron pocket and finished out their shift, making lattes and cleaning tables and smiling at customers. When their break came, they pulled out their phone and looked up the patient advocate position on the hospital's portal. The requirements were less rigid than they'd expected. Bachelor's degree required, master's preferred. Experience in healthcare, social work, education, or related field. Strong communication skills. Ability to work with diverse populations. Commitment to patient-centered care.
Leroy read the description 3 times, mentally checking off qualifications they actually had, skills they could honestly claim. Then they saved the posting, set a reminder to call Susan in HR the next morning, and allowed themselves the smallest flicker of optimism. Maybe giving up that parking spot hadn't been the disaster it seemed. Maybe it had been something else entirely. Not karma. The universe didn't work that way, didn't reward good deeds with convenient opportunities. But maybe just the strange mathematics of chance,
Of being in the right place to overhear the right conversation. Of crossing paths again with someone who remembered what it felt like to be unqualified but determined. That night, Leroy rewrote their cover letter 6 times, trying to strike the balance between professional and authentic, between highlighting their skills and being honest about their gaps in experience. They didn't mention the parking spot, didn't mention the missed interview from 2 months ago, just focused on why they wanted the position, what they could bring to it, how their own struggles with systems had taught them to see the humanity that paperwork and protocols often obscured. They hit submit at 2 in the morning, too anxious to sleep, too hopeful to wait. The next day, they called Susan in HR, mentioned Dr. Alloway's name, was told their application had been flagged for priority review, that someone would be in touch within the week. 4 days later, Leroy got an email requesting an interview. They arrived 15 minutes early, parked in the overflow lot because the closer spots were full, walked through the same route they'd taken 2 months earlier, but this time they weren't running. This time, they were composed, prepared, ready. The interview panel consisted of 3 people: Susan from HR, the Director of Patient Services, and Dr. Angela Alloway, who smiled when Leroy walked in like she'd been expecting them all along. They asked about Leroy's background, their teaching experience, their understanding of healthcare systems. They asked how they'd handled difficult situations, angry family members, language barriers, insurance denials. They asked what Leroy thought patients needed most when navigating the hospital. To be seen, Leroy said, the words coming without planning, without filtering. Not as a case number or a diagnosis, but as a person with a whole life outside of whatever brought them here. Someone who's scared or confused or just trying to do right by the people they love. Everyone who walks through those doors is having one of the worst days of their life, and the system should remember that. Dr. Alloway nodded, something like satisfaction flickering across her face. The interview lasted 45 minutes. They thanked Leroy, said they'd be in touch, all the standard phrases that meant nothing and everything. Leroy walked back to the overflow lot, got in their Honda that was somehow still running despite all odds, and drove to their coffee shop shift with the strange sense that something fundamental had shifted, that the trajectory of their life might actually bend towards something better. The offer came 3 days later. Patient advocate position, starting salary with benefits, the kind of benefits that meant they could finally see a doctor about the persistent pain in their side, could finally stop choosing between necessities, could finally breathe without calculating the cost of each breath. Leroy accepted immediately, gave notice at the coffee shop, told their department chair they'd need to drop the spring adjunct course. For the first time in their adult life, they'd have one job, just one, with health insurance and paid time off and the radical luxury of stability. On their first day, Dr. Alloway stopped by their desk. Really just a desk in a shared space, but it was their desk, their space. "You're going to be good at this," she said without preamble. "How do you know?" Dr. Alloway smiled. "Because you showed up. That's usually the hardest part." She left before Leroy could ask what she meant, before they could thank her properly for the opportunity, for remembering them, for seeing something worth investing in. But maybe that was the point. Maybe the showing up was everything. Not the grand gestures or the perfect qualifications.
but the simple act of being there when it mattered, of making the choice that aligned with who you wanted to be, even when it cost you everything you had. Leroy thought about that parking spot sometimes, about the October morning when they'd given away what felt like their last chance.
About Dr. Alloway rushing to surgery. About a patient whose name they'd never know, whose life had been saved while Leroy sat in a dead car in an overflow lot, wondering if they'd made the stupidest decision of their life. Maybe they had. Or maybe they'd made exactly the right decision for reasons they couldn't have anticipated, in ways that only became clear with distance and time. Either way, they showed up. To the hospital, to the work, to the complicated, messy business of helping people navigate systems that often felt designed to defeat them. And somehow, improbably, that was enough.